Imagine a world where World War II didn't end in 1945 but dragged on for 2 more devastating years. And what if, just as the dust settled, the Third World War erupted? This time it's the USA versus the USSR. History might not have unfolded that way, but what if a single twist could rewrite everything? In this alternate world, nuclear weapons were never invented. No Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, just a relentless march of conventional warfare. Without the looming threat of mutually assured destruction, global power dynamics would have spiraled into unthinkable chaos. Needless to say, things in this world are pretty different from the one we know and inhabit. And you'll want to stick around as we delve into exactly how and why on today's episode of the Infographics Show. What if nuclear weapons were never invented? What would a world look like without nuclear weapons? It's tempting to imagine a global kumbaya moment where everyone holds hands across the world and enjoys a peaceful utopia, but it pains us to say we gotta keep it real. It's hard to find a precise jumping-off point where this historical world would diverge from our own. After all, the story of how we came to eventually learn how to split the atom was decades in the making. The science behind atomic radiation, nuclear change, and fission didn't appear overnight. It began as early as 1895. Early pioneers laid the groundwork, but it was the rapid advancements in atomic research during the 6 pivotal years leading up to 1945 that changed everything. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the main difference in this hypothetical nuclear-free world is that the Manhattan Project, the United States' effort to research and produce the first atomic bombs, never succeeded. We know that the Manhattan Project was created on August 13, 1942. But maybe in the history of this hypothetical nuclear-free world, J. Robert Oppenheimer had a cold and he missed the orientation meeting. Or perhaps one of the scientists on the projects misplaced a crucial decimal point in some research notes and changed the course of history. For whatever reason, the Manhattan Project either fails or never starts, or concludes that it's impossible to split the atom, and nobody ever questions it. This would mean that the US's first ever nuclear test also never took place. On July 16, 1945, a 21-kiloton nuclear weapon was detonated just south of Socorro in New Mexico. So without that test having ever occurred, the area around the testing site would never likely know the lasting effects of radiation, which still remain around 10 times higher than normal levels of natural background radiation. Beyond the testing stages, it's likely the remainder of the Second World War would play out the way it did in the history we know, at least as far as things over in Europe are concerned. By the time 1945 rolled around, Nazi Germany was already on their back foot, on the verge of a crushing defeat. The first major shifts in history would emerge in the war between the US and Japan. Without nuclear weapons, there is no fat man or little boy, no devastating strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring the Second World War to its abrupt and definitive end. In the timeline we're on, the US detonated a uranium bomb over the Japanese island of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The devastating blast killed an estimated 70,000 people, with more dying in the subsequent months thanks to the illnesses caused by exposure to radiation. 3 days later, the second of those atomic weapons, a plutonium bomb this time, exploded over Nagasaki, killing a further 75,000 approximately. Of course, that's the version of history we're all familiar with. But without the involvements of nuclear weapons, how might things have differed? Surely, without the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, a whole lot more people would have been spared some pretty horrific deaths at the hands of the first nuclear weapons ever deployed. Well, yes, but that's not to say that there would have been no casualties in America's war with Japan. Part of the reason President Truman made the decision to drop those fateful nuclear weapons in the first place was because it was estimated that they would kill fewer people, and they actually did kill less people than the alternative. While the death toll from those 2 blasts might have been well into the hundreds of thousands, a proposed invasion of Japan by American forces, codenamed Operation Downfall, would have resulted in millions of deaths. While their Nazi allies over in Europe were faltering, the Imperial Japanese forces were formidable. They were prepared to fight to the bitter end and take as many American troops as they could with them. So without a pair of nuclear aces up their sleeves, the USA would likely have had to go through with Operation Downfall, invading the Japanese islands and likely causing a whole lot of casualties. And it wouldn't just be Japanese troops and civilians, but American forces too. They wouldn't be taking the brunt of those losses alone though, with the Soviets also invading Japan and advancing through Hokkaido simultaneously. Within the first few months of the invasion, Japan would have been caught between both the USA and the USSR, with the latter coming down through the mainland Asia along the Korean peninsula. The division of North and South Korea might never occur. Instead, a single unified Korea could fall under the iron grip of the Kim dynasty, whose control in our timeline is limited to the north. With the Operation Downfall invasion beginning in 1945, rather than the Second World War ending that same year, it would likely continue possibly until around 1947. During that time, America would sustain huge casualties, though the USSR would have likely had their fair share too. When Japanese forces eventually fell through relentless Allied offensives, the cost would be staggering. The Pacific Theater, already one of the most brutal campaigns in modern warfare, could see its death toll double. It's also likely that, much like Korea was, or Germany over in Europe, Japan would be divided amongst the two invading superpowers. With the USSR advancing from the north, a communist regime could establish control over northeastern Japan, potentially with Sapporo, strategically located on the island of Hokkaido, as its capital. Meanwhile, the southwestern regions, anchored by US-led forces, would form a capitalist state, with a natural choice for its capital being either Tokyo, the nation's historical and cultural hub, or Osaka, a key economic powerhouse. Now, any peace between the USA and USSR post the extending of World War II wouldn't last forever. As with our own history, these two enormous superpowers can't exactly coexist without some tension. A conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union seems pretty likely, especially if things carried on like they did in our history post-1945. For 45 years, the Cold War saw the US and USSR stockpiling nuclear weapons and living in fear of each other. Each side lived under constant threat of mutual destruction, backing opposing factions in proxy wars that spanned the globe and engaging in continued acts of aggression. In this new world, while the key nuclear component would be missing, there could very well be a Cold War driven even more by the conflicting ideologies of communism and capitalism. The expansion of the Soviet Union across parts of Europe and the American-backed opposition to it would likely play out very similarly. But without the added concern of nuclear retaliation, certain historical events would be missing from the new timeline. The Cold War would be far more focused on the expansion of territory controlled by either the USA or USSR or their respective ideological allies, instead of, well, the same but with nukes. But this is all based on one thing: the assumed rationality of one Joseph Stalin, a man not exactly known for his rationality. During his time in power, the Soviet leader believed that a war with the West was inevitable. And while they were allied against the Nazis in World War II, that was a relationship that was never going to last. Since the consequences of going into a direct war with America would be lessened in this new timeline, Stalin might try his luck and take advantage of the weakened state of the US after such a lengthy and costly invasion of Japan. After all, in this hypothetical world, there is no longer any nuclear threat, and the possibility that America can use atomic weapons against the Soviet Union is no longer a concern. In other words, it might be time for a sequel, a third World War, only a few years after the second. The United States is still reeling from the invasion of Japan, and with no nuclear deterrent, would be sitting ducks for Stalin. Striking at the US and other Western powers, he could possibly start a conflict in the now divided Japan sometime in the 50s. Over in Europe, the Soviets could easily conquer most of Germany. At the time, the United States had anticipated such a move and prepared for it. They even developed plans to hold the Soviet forces at the Rhine River in case a conflict broke out. The USA wouldn't be completely defenseless against a Soviet attack, thanks to a superior navy, which would be vital in pushing back against Stalin's strikes if he started in Japan. This naval superiority could also offer the US an opportunity to launch their own invasion of continental Asia, possibly even seizing southern Korea. But it's unlikely that they would be able to progress much further, especially with their forces already depleted following the grueling losses of Operation Downfall. Over in Europe, the Western Allied forces could potentially drive the attacking Soviet troops back towards central Germany. If the Allies were able to push the USSR back to their borders, the people living in Soviet-controlled states might even see this as a sign of weakness from the occupying army. Any rebellion against Soviet rule would mean the USSR would be forced to divert troops to quell these uprisings, meaning fewer soldiers available to fight off the Allies. Assuming a victory for the US and its allies, it's likely that this Third World War would have been brought to an end and a peace treaty would be signed in the late 50s. As a likely consequence of their role in inciting another global conflict, the USSR would be forced to relinquish much of the territory it gained during World War II. This includes the land they managed to hold onto throughout the Cold War in our timeline. Of course, in this new version of events, a Third World War might actually circumvent a Cold War. After all, if you just fought two global-scale conflicts, you'd probably want to take a break. And that would likely be the state America would be in after two wars in a row. US industry would need time to recover. This might even mean that they have no involvement in the Vietnam War, since the Soviet Union would be forced back to its pre-World War II borders, and it likely wouldn't be able to back the Viet Cong. It's hard to say if this would result in a pacifist United States or a more warlike US of A. After the betrayal of the USSR launching them into World War III, it's likely that America wouldn't be so forgiving of their adversaries. Despite their potential defeat, Russia might ironically become even stronger than they are now, too. A defeat by the capitalist West would likely cause the USSR to abandon their communist system. If other historical events played out similarly to our timeline, losing the space race during the 1960s would deal another devastating blow to the USSR. This failure could accelerate its collapse, potentially as early as the 1970s. An earlier dissolution of the Soviet Union would open new doors for countries like Ukraine and the Baltic states. These nations might join NATO sooner, especially if they'd already gained independence through peace treaties after a hypothetical World War III. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia would likely see a resurgence. History shows that during times of upheaval, the nation often gravitates towards strong, centralized leadership. It's possible that they would quickly rally around a charismatic strongman, someone capable of uniting the country, restoring order, and reshaping Russia's role on the global stage. But there are plenty of other big changes that would likely occur in a world without the Manhattan Project. Some of the wildest would be seen in the field of warfare. Of course, a world without nuclear weapons isn't necessarily going to be one without weapons of any other kind. While the advancement of certain new forms of warfare might well have been snubbed by the advent of the atomic age, that didn't stop other developments in weapons technology in the decades following the end of World War II. War is, even more so now than ever, a business. Without the existence of nuclear weapons, arms companies would likely compete to create something equally as powerful, or possibly even more destructive, to outdo their rivals. For example, take the horrifying concept being developed at the tail end of the Second World War, the earthquake bomb. Also known as the seismic bomb, the idea was pioneered during the early days of the war by Barnes Wallis, a British aeronautical engineer. The concept itself was dramatically different from a standard bomb that would explode on impact or detonate just above the surface, after being dropped, destroying its target with a huge fireball of explosive force. The key difference with one of Wallis's proposed seismic bombs was that they would be more aerodynamic, with an armored tip, and it would be dropped from an extremely high altitude. They also need to be considerably heavier than conventional bombs in order for them to build up to supersonic speeds as they hurtle toward the ground. The goal was for these to penetrate the ground like a bullet being fired straight down at the speed of an artillery shell. Upon impact, though, these bombs would not detonate. The sheer velocity would cause them to burrow underground. With the help of a delayed timer, the bombs would be set to explode once they had made their way deep into the earth, ideally directly underneath or close to its target. The resulting explosion would trigger intense shockwaves traveling through the ground, destroying enemy positions from under their feet. In some estimates, the resultant shockwave would have the equivalent force of a 3.6 magnitude earthquake. Seismic weapons like these were thought to be perfect for attacking targets that were either too large or too difficult to target using conventional explosive ordnance, like bridges or viaducts. But earthquake bombs weren't just theoretical, some were even developed and used during the Second World War, and modern variations even exist today. Toward the end of the war, weapons like the Tallboy bomb, developed by Wallis himself, and the Grand Slam bomb were already in development. The introduction of nuclear weapons didn't stop the development of earthquake bombs, although it did lead to these seismic weapons playing a significantly smaller role. It's likely that had nuclear weapons never been developed, earthquake bombs could be among the most powerful and lethal explosives in the world. The Guided Bomb Unit 57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator is the current big boy of so-called bunker buster bombs. 19 feet long, weighing around 27,000 pounds, the GBU-57s are substantially larger than previously available bunker-busting ordnance. They're used by the United States Air Force to target heavily defended enemy installations, including those housing weapons of mass destruction. Had even further development been made on seismic weapons like this, instead of nuclear weaponry, then we'd likely already have something even more advanced than the GBU-57s, but without the limitations. These massive ordnance penetrators currently lack a void-sensing fuse, meaning that they can only detonate once they've gone deep enough into the ground and come to a stop. This means that they can occasionally miss their target. On top of that, given their sheer size and weight, only extremely large bombing craft like the B-2 Spirit can even carry them. In a world without nukes and more earthquake bombs, we'd likely not only see more large-scale bombers in order to deploy them, but also better detonation systems for these deadly explosives. Let's say that instead of earthquake bombs, nuclear weapons never being invented instead allowed a different kind of ordnance to be pushed further. Thermobaric bombs share many similarities with earthquake bombs. However, they operate differently by dispersing clouds of gas, fuel, or powdered explosives in aerosol form. For this reason, they also are referred to as aerosol bombs or vacuum bombs. Detonating a thermobaric bomb causes huge airborne shockwaves that can not only leave behind devastating collateral damage to a target area, but also engulf it in fire. Also called fuel-air explosive devices or FAE, early generations of these weapons, like the CBU-55, saw extensive deployment by the US throughout the Vietnam War. In a world without nuclear weapons, thermobaric bombs might have been developed on a much larger scale. Such weapons could have emerged to meet the strategic needs not just of the US, but potentially every major military superpower around the globe. Oh, that's right, it's not only America that has access to thermobaric weapons. Countries all over the world have their own variations. During the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict, it's believed that FAE devices were used against China by the Soviet Union. British forces, including both the Royal Air Force and Army Air Corps, used thermobaric AGM-114N Hellfire missiles against the Taliban during the war in Afghanistan. They also deployed drones dropping the exact same missiles during the Syrian civil war, firing 92 thermobaric Hellfire missiles within the first 3 months of 2018 alone. By now, this hypothetical world free of nuclear weapons could instead be living in fear of bigger and more deadlier thermobaric bombs. Development into these weapons could have made them powerful enough to decimate entire cities or destroy enemy military bases, perhaps even putting their destructive potential on par with that of nuclear warheads. Thermobaric bombs could have even been developed further into cluster munitions as well, a form of explosive weapon that releases smaller explosives in order to cover a larger area of effect. On the topic of cluster munitions, it's also not out of the realm of possibility that these could take on an even more dangerous form in a world without nukes. Common cluster bombs can eject smaller explosives or bomblets that are designed to either kill as many enemy personnel as possible or destroy enemy vehicles. These cluster bombs release so many smaller bomblets over such a wide radius, they pose a significantly higher risk to civilians too. And not just during a bombing attack, but even long after a conflict has ended. If bomblets are scattered over an area and remain unexploded, they can unintentionally kill or injure civilians. They're not only dangerous but also costly to find and remove. And worse, the failure rate for detonation can range from as low as 2% to as high as 40%. In short, if all the bomblets of a cluster bomb don't detonate, it's hardly a cause to celebrate. The development of more efficient versions of weapons like cluster bombs could have also resulted in weapons causing widespread damage being deployed on a massive scale. Incendiary devices, weapons designed to start fires, could have also been developed into cluster munitions as well. This would combine all the worst aspects of thermobaric weapons and cluster bombs into weapons that could even be used to create firestorms, such as those seen during the bombing of Hamburg over the course of World War II. The Allied forces' sustained bombing campaign targeted more than just military installations. Civilians and civic infrastructure were also in the crosshairs, including shipyards, U-boat pens, and oil refineries. These critical sites made Hamburg one of Germany's most industrialized cities, and therefore a key target. An attack during the last week of July 1943, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, killed between 34,000 and 43,000 people thanks to firestorms raised during the bombing. While these weren't caused by cluster bombs, as these kinds of munitions were developed in the decades after the war, a world without nuclear arms could allow cluster munitions to reach an even greater destructive potential. Firestorms like the one in Hamburg in 1943 could have occurred in far more subsequent conflicts, claiming who knows how many lives as a result. Since May of 2008, numerous nations have ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions, prohibiting the use of bombs like these. In fact, this convention even became international law, and as of February 2022, a total of 124 states have joined it. In a world without nuclear arsenals, it's doubtful so many countries would agree to outlaw this kind of weaponry. It's equally uncertain whether a treaty to prevent the stockpiling of cluster munitions would even be considered. Let's say then, for the sake of this hypothetical scenario, that cluster munitions were still considered too dangerous in a world with no nukes. The Convention on Cluster Munitions still stands and prevents countries from developing and creating these weapons. Perhaps the same even goes for earthquake bombs and thermobaric weapons. No one is ever able to reach the same level of destruction as a nuclear weapon would. But then, there are chemical weapons. Chemical weapons could, in theory, flourish in a world without nuclear weapons. It's already a terrifying enough prospect that these types of weapons do still exist in the real world, alongside nuclear weaponry. Much like nukes, chemical weapons are considered to be weapons of mass destruction that are especially designed to disperse harmful chemicals to harm or inflict death on enemy soldiers or unfortunate civilians. In fact, under a number of treaties that prohibit the use of chemical weapons, these weapons are defined as anything that uses a chemical compound to harm individuals. This includes killing, injuring, or temporarily incapacitating someone, as well as causing sensory irritation such as blindness. Phosgene gas is one such example, seeing wide use during the First World War. You probably know it by its other name, mustard gas, which was capable of causing searing burns to the lungs when inhaled, as well as blindness and death. During the Second World War, another similarly infamous chemical weapon was found in the chemical compound hydrogen cyanide, which can be lethal when absorbed into the blood. This compound was originally found in a commercially available pesticide invented in Germany during the 1920s. 2 decades later, it was weaponized to facilitate industrialized genocide against Jewish people and other targeted groups in Nazi gas chambers. Even today, the Holocaust stands as the deadliest use of chemical weapons in history. Today, CS gas and pepper spray, 2 of the most commonly found chemical weapons, are used in policing, primarily as a form of riot control. Though they are considered non-lethal, that's not to say they haven't been used to leave some lasting injuries. The 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, much like the aforementioned Convention on Cluster Munitions, legally banned the production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. However, that hasn't stopped many countries holding on to stockpiles of these weapons, often justified as being a precaution in case of an attack by an aggressor. In a world without nuclear weapons, it's not improbable that chemical weapons would have the potential to be developed far enough to match the destructive capacity of a nuke. Just imagining a neurotoxin being released by one country over another is so horrifying it sounds like the premise for a zombie apocalypse movie. But in reality, something as dangerous as botulism toxin released in a populated area could potentially kill millions of people. Add the wind into the mix and you've got a natural way for that toxin to spread, allowing it to continue to devastate huge areas and take even more lives. There's one potential drawback in this scenario though, and that ties to the existing problem of storing a large quantity of chemical weapons. Much like those eggs and that carton of milk that you got from the grocery store, those things don't stay good forever. Chemical weapons do have a shelf life of around 20 years, but over that time they start to deteriorate and they can even become increasingly volatile. Storing chemical weapons is almost as much of a toxic hazard as deploying them, and the longer they're kept, the more of a risk they pose. And as for disposing of them, well, that's a hassle, to say the least. Destroying chemical agents can be massively harmful to the environment, and their lasting effects can vary depending on factors like temperature, acidity, or alkalinity of the compound. Some chemical spills are persistent too. Spills of sulfur mustards can remain dangerous for decades. At first glance, biological warfare might sound similar to chemical warfare, but to clarify, biological warfare, also known as germ warfare, involves the use of infectious agents as weapons of war. These agents include viruses, bacteria, insects, or even certain fungi. Here's how to tell the difference. Chemical weapons affect many people in a single area but aren't contagious. Once exposed, the effects don't spread from person to person. Biological weapons, on the other hand, require just one exposed individual to create a chain reaction, spreading the effects to others. In this scenario, without nuclear weaponry, research into biological warfare could well reach a point where it's possible to infect entire populations with specialized diseases. Any kind of replicating entity, from living organisms like germs to viruses which aren't always alive, could be deployed by one country against another. Without a cure readily available, these infections could spread easily, incapacitating or even killing entire populations as they pass from person to person. Now add insects to the equation, and things take an even darker turn. Insect warfare or entomological warfare is a specialized subset of biological warfare. Imagine an army of killer bees unleashed on enemy crops, decimating food supplies and causing mass starvation, all without a single shot being fired. What makes this even more terrifying is the plausible deniability it offers. A biological weapon like this could easily be disguised as a freak act of nature. Nothing to do with us, just ignore that buzzing sound coming from that box marked murder bees. Any of the aforementioned weapons could be developed to the point of being as big of a threat as nuclear arms are in our world. It's likely that these weapons would be adapted to large intercontinental ballistic missiles, because nothing says scary weapon like a huge missile. Instead of stockpiling nukes, superpowers would still be able to threaten each other with instant annihilation, whether it's by large-scale earthquake bombs, payloads of deadly gases, thermobaric weapons with a wide enough area to wipe out a city, or missiles capable of dispersing biological threat agents. In fact, in the real world, a huge part of the reason many of these weapons aren't deployed, apart from the various international treaties and conventions banning them, is because the threat they pose is overshadowed by just how much damage nuclear weapons can do. The horrific amount of death they can deliver, not just through their initial blast, but through exposure to radioactive fallout, pretty much makes any other weapon, even some of the worst imaginable, almost pale in comparison. Take those nukes away, or in a world where they were never invented to begin with, and it's hardly likely that countries would simply lay down all arms of any kind. In a world without nukes, it's still highly likely that global superpowers would amass massive stockpiles of devastating weaponry. These arsenals could include missiles armed with neurotoxins, capable of killing thousands, or even hundreds of thousands within moments. In fact, it could be worse than just ongoing, never-ending tensions between countries and their arsenals. The advent of nuclear weapons didn't just change warfare, but even fundamentally rewrote the rules when it came to how diplomacy and international affairs were managed. A world reliant on other types of weaponry, still dangerous but not as wholly devastating as nuclear arms, would foster entirely different values in diplomacy. Before the advent of nuclear weapons, the world endured 2 global conflicts and countless smaller wars between nations. While smaller-scale conflicts didn't vanish in the post-nuclear era, there was a clear difference in how nations approached full-scale wars. Before the end of the Second World War, countries were far less hesitant to engage in large-scale conflicts, doing so on a semi-regular basis without the looming threat of mutually assured destruction to hold them back. In our hypothetical nuke-free world, not having the threat of nuclear annihilation being dangled over our heads could well lead to international diplomacy taking, well, other more directly aggressive forms. This could even have a continuation of the cycle seen over the centuries leading up to the First World War and the Second World War, with periodic large-scale wars being fought, followed by brief periods of peace, only for another new conflict to arise. As idyllic as a world without nuclear weaponry sounds on paper, the unfortunate reality is it wouldn't be a world without warfare. Countries would still have the means to devastate enemy armies, wipe out civilian populations, and leave cities uninhabitable at the mere push of a button. Even if their scary new toys were just a deterrent, without concerns surrounding nuclear weapons looming over diplomatic relations, global powers would likely be a whole lot more cutthroat with each other. Now, it's worth remembering the Manhattan Project and the advent of nuclear weapons didn't just give humanity access to the most lethal and horrifying weapons imaginable, it also furthered other fields of science, particularly when it came to energy. So that begs the question, would our world without nuclear weapons also be a world without nuclear power? Well, that is pretty likely. While most of the developments in nuclear science were focused on the atomic bomb between 1939 and 1945, post-war the focus shifted. Instead, scientists sought to figure out how to harness the kind of energy created through nuclear fission. The primary focus since 1956 has been evolving the technology to create more reliable nuclear power plants. Given that the civil nuclear industry came as a direct result of the atomic bomb programs like the Manhattan Project, it's highly likely that a world without nuclear weapons would also be a world without nuclear power. This intrinsic link between the two suggests that without the push for military applications, the development of nuclear energy for civilian use might never have occurred. That wouldn't just mean having no access to electricity generated by nuclear power stations, but also there wouldn't be any further application of nuclear technologies, such as being used for propulsion systems in nuclear-powered submarines. Now, optimistically, we would like to say that this might offer a ray of hope for our alarming alternate history world, at least when it comes to energy. With no nuclear weapons and no nuclear power as a result, there could be further research, funding, and development into sustainable and renewable sources of cleaner energy. Solar power and wind turbines could very well be generating a large amount of the world's electricity. Without nuclear power as an alternative, the world might confront the reality of Earth's finite fossil fuel reserves much earlier. Rather than relying heavily on these limited resources, nations could be driven to invest in alternative energy sources. But then again, that could be the case now in the real world. As we've seen in recent years, the interests of fossil fuel companies have continued our reliance on oil and gas as energy sources. We could be developing more efficient solar or wind farms to harness more sustainable energy, and we're living in a world that has the added benefits of access to nuclear power. In a world without that, the profit-driven reliance on finite resources would likely persist. These resources not only harm the environment but are steadily depleting. with little thought given to the future. Even in a world where nuclear weapons were never invented, this unsustainable pattern isn't going away. What do you think a world without nuclear weapons would look like? Would it be a safer, more peaceful place? Or would we face new and unexpected challenges? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out What If the USA Launched a Nuclear Bomb Minute by Minute, or click on this video instead.